The table was always too loud when Daniel was around. Every family gathering at Mom's house turned into a stage show, and Daniel was always the star. He would lean back in his chair, loosen the top button of his shirt, and start talking about his job like the rest of us were taking notes. He was a corporate operations manager at a logistics company downtown. He said it with a kind of pride that filled the whole room. And everyone listened. My aunts, my uncles, even Mom would nod along with wide eyes, like he had just announced something historic. I sat at the far end of the table, quietly eating, not saying much. That was my usual position. Not just at the table, in the family, in every room Daniel ever walked into. I was the younger sister, Maya. The quiet one. The one who did little freelance projects, as Daniel liked to call it. He said those words with a small smile on his face, like he was humoring a child. Like my work was something I did to keep busy, not something real. I had learned not to argue. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I knew something he didn't. And that truth, I had decided, would speak for itself one day. It started years before that dinner table. I was 24 when I bought my first small commercial unit. It was a tiny strip of office space on the edge of town. Nothing glamorous, just a narrow building with chipped paint and old wiring. But I saw what it could be. I spent months learning everything I could about commercial real estate. I read books, took online courses, spoke to brokers, and studied how successful property developers structured their businesses. By the time I was 26, I had renovated that first unit, leased it to 2 small businesses, and used the rental income to buy a second property. I moved quietly on purpose. I registered everything under a holding company called Breyer Holdings. No photos, no press, no social media announcements. People in our family knew I did some kind of freelance work, and I let them think that. Daniel had once laughed at a family dinner and said freelancers were just people who couldn't get real jobs. I smiled and said nothing. I remember that moment clearly. It was the moment I decided I would never explain myself to him. I would just keep building. And one day, the buildings themselves would do the explaining. By the time I was 29, Breyer Holdings managed 7 commercial properties across 3 districts. The portfolio included office spaces, retail units, and one mid-size warehouse I had recently converted into a creative studio complex. I had a small trusted team, a property manager named Yolanda, a sharp young accountant called Felix, and a legal advisor, Mr. Osei, who had helped me structure the holding company from the very beginning. They knew who I was. Everyone else just knew Breyer Holdings. I had chosen this deliberately. Not because I was ashamed, but because I had seen what happened to people who announced their success too early. They got distracted by attention. They started performing for an audience instead of working toward a goal. I wanted to build something solid and real before the world got a chance to have an opinion about it. My life looked completely ordinary from the outside. I drove a modest car, rented a mid-range apartment, and wore simple clothes. At family gatherings, I listened more than I talked. Daniel, who wore tailored blazers and liked to discuss his quarterly targets over dinner, had no reason to look twice at me. And he never did. That suited me just fine. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday in November. I was at my office reviewing plans for my biggest project yet, a large commercial development on Halcyon Street, a prime stretch of land near the new transit hub. I had spent 2 years negotiating for that land. The deal had finally closed 3 months before, and construction was well underway. The Halcyon development would be the crown of everything I had built. It would house 12 commercial tenants, 2 anchor businesses, and a rooftop event space. The building was being designed by an architect named Kwame, whose firm had done work for several city landmarks. When I stood at the construction site and looked at the rising steel frame, I felt something settle deep inside me. This was real. This was mine. My name, Maya Osei Breyer, the registered owner, was on every legal document attached to that land. The day that building opened, there would be no hiding. But I wasn't ready for that moment yet. I still had work to do. And I still had a brother who had no idea the world he lived in was quietly being shaped by the sister he had written off. I found out about Daniel's situation the way most family news traveled, through Mom. She called me on a Wednesday evening, her voice tight. She said Daniel's company was going through a restructuring. Several senior managers were being let go. Daniel was one of them. I listened carefully, keeping my voice steady. "Is he okay?" I asked. Mom said he was embarrassed more than anything. He had built so much of his identity around that job title. Without it, she said, he didn't quite know who he was. I stayed on the phone with her for a long time, asking gentle questions. Inside, I felt something complicated. I didn't feel joy at his fall, which some people might have expected. But I also didn't feel the need to rush over and console him. Daniel and I had a long history, and most of it had been shaped by his words cutting me down whenever I was in the room. I hung up the phone and sat quietly for a moment. Then I turned back to my desk and opened the file for the Halcyon building. There was still so much to do, and I realized with a strange calm that our stories were about to cross paths in a way neither of us had planned. About 6 weeks after Daniel lost his job, my property manager Yolanda mentioned that she was processing applications for a senior operations position at the Halcyon building. The building was almost complete, and we needed someone to manage day-to-day facility operations, a big role with real responsibility. She had received a strong application from someone with 10 years of logistics and operations experience. "His name is Daniel Amoa," she said, setting the file on my desk. I looked at the name and went still. It was him, my brother. He had applied to work in my building. I read through his resume carefully. It was genuinely impressive. His experience was a solid match for what the role required. I set the file down and looked out the window for a long time. Yolanda watched me. "Do you know him?" she asked quietly. "Yes," I said. "He's my brother." There was a long silence. Then I told her to process his application the same way she would any other. If he was the best candidate, he would get the job. I would not interfere, not to help him and not to block him. Whatever happened, it would happen on merit. That was the only way I could live with it. Daniel passed every stage of the interview process without knowing who owned the company he was applying to. Breyer Holdings was listed on all the documents, and the interview panel was made up of Yolanda and 2 department leads. My name appeared nowhere in the process. He was sharp in the interviews. Yolanda told me he had presented a detailed 3-month operations plan during the final round, complete with staffing recommendations and cost efficiency strategies. She was impressed. "He really knows operations," she admitted. "He does," I agreed. Whatever I thought of Daniel personally, I had always known he was good at his work. Pride wasn't his only quality. He was also genuinely skilled. 2 days after the final interview, Yolanda sent him the offer letter. He accepted within the hour. I imagined him sitting at his kitchen table, relieved, maybe even excited. A new start. A modern building. A company called Breyer Holdings that sounded stable and professional. He had no reason to ask deeper questions. He was just glad to have a job again. What he didn't know was that his first day of work would be inside a building that his younger sister had designed, financed, and built from the ground up. The Halcyon building opened its doors on a bright Tuesday morning in February. I watched from across the street as the first staff members arrived. I wore a plain jacket and a cap, standing near a coffee cart like any other passerby. I saw Daniel arrive in a new shirt, looking confident but slightly nervous. He walked into the building like a man starting over. And in many ways he was. I allowed myself one small moment of feeling, not revenge, not triumph. Something quieter. Something that felt like patience finally rewarded. Then I walked away and went back to my office. I had made a decision not to show up at the building during normal working hours, at least for the first few weeks. I didn't want to create a scene before the staff had a chance to settle. I would manage everything through Yolanda remotely, the way I had always run my properties. Daniel would do his job, I would do mine, and for a while, we would exist in the same building without ever crossing paths. That was the plan. But plans, I had learned, have a way of shifting. Especially when the truth is large enough that it can't stay hidden forever. A family dinner came around 3 weeks after the building opened. Mom made her famous pepper soup, and the whole house smelled warm and familiar. Daniel arrived looking like himself again, the version of himself that filled a room. He talked about his new job with pride. He described the Halcyon building in glowing terms. "It's a serious operation," he said, helping himself to more rice. "Whoever owns that company knows what they're doing. Very professional setup." Mom smiled at him. "So things are going well?" she asked. "Very well," he said confidently. "The building is first class. Best place I've worked, honestly." He didn't look at me once during that conversation. I sat on the other side of the table, listening carefully, stirring my soup slowly. One of my aunts asked him who owned Breyer Holdings. Daniel shrugged and said it was some kind of private investment group. "These holding companies are always mysterious," he laughed. I looked down at my bowl. I thought about the documents locked in my office with my name across every page. I thought about the building he had just called first class. Then I quietly reached for the bread and said nothing at all. The first near miss came about a month later. I had gone to the Halcyon building early on a Saturday morning to meet Kwame, the architect, for a final walkthrough of the rooftop event space. I wore casual clothes and carried a notepad, looking like I could have been anyone: a consultant, a contractor's assistant, a building inspector. The lobby was quiet. Most staff didn't come in on Saturdays. Kwame and I took the elevator up to the rooftop and spent an hour walking through the space. It was everything I had imagined. Wide open sky, clean lines, a view of the city that made everything feel possible. On the way back down, the elevator opened on the third floor, and Daniel stepped in. He was wearing a t-shirt and jeans, clearly working a half day on his own time. He looked at me with a polite, neutral expression, the way you look at a stranger in an elevator. "Morning," he said. "Morning," I said back. He looked at Kwame, then back at his phone. He had no idea. We rode down together in complete silence. When the doors opened, he walked to his office without a second glance. I stepped outside into the morning air and exhaled slowly. That had been close. Very close. The second near miss was harder to navigate. Daniel had started building a good reputation at the building. Yolanda mentioned that he was well liked by the tenants and had already introduced a new maintenance scheduling system that saved time and reduced complaints. I was quietly proud of that, even if I could never say so. But then one afternoon, he sent an email through the internal system asking to meet the property owner. He wanted to discuss ideas for expanding the parking facility on the east side of the building. It was a genuinely good idea, one I had been considering myself. The email landed in Yolanda's inbox, not mine. She forwarded it to me. "How do you want to handle this?" she asked. I thought carefully. I told her to respond on my behalf, thank him for the initiative, and let him know the owner was reviewing the proposal. I asked her to handle all communication with him going forward, as I normally did with staff. She nodded. No questions. But I could feel it. The walls were getting thinner. Daniel was good at his job, which meant he was going to keep pushing, keep asking questions, keep looking for the person at the top. It was only a matter of time. I started to think carefully about timing. The Halcyon building had a public ribbon-cutting ceremony planned for the following month. It was a big event. City officials, press, business community leaders, and all the building's tenants would be in attendance. The local business newspaper had been asking for weeks to feature the owner of Briar Holdings. They had even called my story one of the most quietly impressive commercial real estate rises in the city. I had avoided the interview for months. But now, with the ceremony approaching, I knew I couldn't stay invisible much longer. My lawyer, Mr. Osei, had strongly advised that I attend. Yolanda agreed. Even Felix, my usually reserved accountant, said the ceremony was too important for me not to be there. "This is your moment," Yolanda told me gently. "You built this. You should stand in front of it." I sat with that for a few days. The thought of being public didn't scare me the way it once had. What made me pause was the knowledge that Daniel would be in the room. He would be standing in the building he now managed. And he would watch me walk to that stage as its owner. I thought about how that would feel, for both of us. Mom called me the week before the ceremony. She had seen a small announcement in the local paper. Something about a major ribbon-cutting event for a new commercial development called the Halcyon Building, owned by Briar Holdings. The article mentioned a rare public appearance from the company's founder. Mom didn't put the name together. My holding company wasn't registered under my full name. But she was excited about the building itself. She said it was in the same area where Daniel worked. "Isn't that something?" she said warmly. "What a beautiful building. Your aunt drove past it and said it looks incredible." I smiled into the phone. "It does look nice," I said. "Are you going to the ceremony?" she asked, just making conversation. I paused for a beat. "I think so," I said. She asked who I knew there. I told her I had done some consulting work connected to the project. That wasn't entirely untrue. She asked no more questions. I felt a familiar mix of feelings, guilt about the omission, but also certainty that the moment of truth was coming fast, and it needed to arrive the right way. Not over the phone. Not explained. Revealed. The night before the ceremony, I sat in my apartment with the building's ownership documents spread on the table in front of me. My name was on every single one. Maya Abina Osei Briar. Sole owner. Registered proprietor. Founding director of Briar Holdings. I had looked at these documents hundreds of times over the years. But that night they felt different. Heavier. Not in a bad way, more like the weight of everything they represented. Years of early mornings. Evenings spent on the phone with contractors and brokers. Weekends walking through empty buildings with a notepad, imagining what they could become. No one from my family had seen any of it. Daniel had spent those same years assuming I was drifting, that I lacked focus, that my little freelance projects would never add up to anything meaningful. I gathered the documents carefully and placed them back in their folder. Then I ironed the suit I was going to wear the next day, a deep navy blue with clean lines. Simple but strong. I wanted to look like exactly what I was. Not dressed up for an audience. Just myself. The person I had always been, finally in full view. The morning of the ceremony, I arrived at the Halcyon building 2 hours before the event. The lobby had been set up with a long ribbon across the main entrance, clusters of chairs facing a small podium, and a display of framed photos documenting the building's construction from empty land to finished structure. I walked through slowly, running my hand along the wall. Smooth concrete, warm lighting, clean flooring, exactly as I had planned it. Yolanda met me at the entrance and gave me a small, proud smile. "Ready," she said. "Almost," I replied. I walked upstairs to the rooftop one last time before the guests arrived. The city stretched out below me in every direction. I had stood on rooftops of my earlier buildings too, but this one felt different. This was the one that would put Breyer Holdings on the map. This was the one that would make everything I had done undeniable. I stayed up there for about 10 minutes, breathing the cool morning air. Then I came back down, straightened my jacket, and walked toward the lobby. Guests were beginning to arrive. Somewhere in the building, Daniel was preparing to manage the event, not knowing that the owner he had never met was about to walk through the front door. The guests filled the lobby quickly. City councilors, newspaper reporters, business owners, property developers, and community leaders moved around the space. The buzz was warm and genuine. I recognized a few faces from industry circles, but let Yolanda handle most of the greetings. I stayed to one side watching. Then I saw Daniel. He was near the entrance in a crisp suit, directing guests toward seating with a quiet efficiency that showed how good he was at his job. He caught my eye briefly across the room. A flicker of recognition passed over his face. He knew me from the elevator that Saturday morning. I saw him squint slightly, trying to place me. I held his gaze for just a second, then looked away. He went back to his duties. A reporter from the business newspaper approached me and introduced herself as Adwoa. She shook my hand warmly. "We're so glad you agreed to speak today," she said. "Breyer Holdings has been a bit of a local mystery. People are very curious about you." I smiled. "There's no mystery," I said. "Just work." She laughed softly and moved to take her seat. I adjusted the collar of my jacket and walked toward the podium area. The ribbon cutting was 8 minutes away. The city councilor gave the opening remarks. He spoke about the importance of local commercial development, the rise of mixed-use buildings, and the positive impact the Halcyon project would have on the surrounding district. It was a good speech. The audience was engaged. I sat in the front row, hands folded, watching the room. Then the counselor said my name. "And now I would like to invite the founder and sole owner of Breyer Holdings, the woman behind the Halcyon building, Maya Abina Osei Breyer." A ripple of applause moved through the room. I stood, buttoned my jacket, and walked to the podium. As I passed through the audience, I heard someone make a sharp sound, a small, strangled gasp. I didn't turn to look. I already knew who it was. I reached the podium, looked out at the crowd, and took a slow breath. In the middle of the room, Daniel was standing very still. His face had gone the color of pale wood. His mouth was open slightly. His eyes were locked on me with an expression I had never seen from him before, raw, absolute disbelief. I looked at him for exactly 1 second. Then I turned to the microphone and began to speak. "Thank you all for being here today," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "I started Breyer Holdings at 24 in a city that had no particular reason to believe in me. I bought my first property with savings from 3 years of careful work. I made mistakes. I had difficult seasons. But I kept going because I believed that the work itself, done quietly, done honestly, was always enough." I paused, letting the room settle. This building is the result of 7 years of focused effort. Every brick, every lease agreement, every design decision has been a deliberate step forward. I didn't build it for recognition. I built it because I believed in what it could give to the businesses inside it and the community around it. I could feel Daniel's eyes on me from somewhere in the crowd. I didn't look at him. I kept my gaze on the room as a whole. I want to thank my team, Yolanda, Felix, and Mr. Osei, for being with me every step of the way. And I want to thank this city for giving this building a home. Applause filled the lobby. I stepped back. The counselor handed me the ceremonial scissors, and together we cut the red ribbon. The room broke into warm celebration. After the ribbon cutting, the room shifted into a relaxed mingling phase. Guests moved around with drinks and small plates, talking in groups. I was approached by several people, developers wanting to discuss future projects, tenants wanting to introduce themselves, journalists wanting quick quotes. I moved through the conversations calmly, one at a time. Through it all, I was aware of Daniel. He had recovered enough to move around the room again, though he was quieter now. He was doing his job, guiding guests, solving small logistical problems, making sure everything ran smoothly. I noticed he was very careful not to come near me. At one point, I caught him looking at me from across the lobby with the same stunned expression he'd had during the speech. His jaw was tight. His hands were clasped behind his back. He looked like a man who was using every ounce of his energy to hold himself together in a professional setting. I understood that. This was not the moment for a breakdown. He knew it, and I was grateful for it. Whatever was going to happen between us would not happen here, in front of reporters and city officials. We were both professionals, and today at least that held. The event ended in the early afternoon. Guests filed out slowly, shaking hands, exchanging cards. The lobby gradually emptied, and the catering staff began clearing the tables. I stayed until almost everyone had gone, speaking with the last few guests and making sure Yolanda had what she needed to close out the day. Then I walked toward the elevator, suddenly very tired. As the doors opened, Daniel was standing there. We came face to face with nowhere to go. The elevator was empty. We both stepped in without a word. The doors slid closed. Silence. It lasted 7 floors. Then Daniel spoke. His voice was low and carefully controlled. "How long?" he asked. I looked straight ahead at the smooth metal doors. 7 years, I said. He exhaled slowly. "This whole building?" I nodded. "Everything under Breyer Holdings." Another long silence settled between us. The elevator doors opened at the lobby level, and we both stepped out into the empty foyer. He stopped walking. I did too. We stood a few feet apart in the hush of the building. He looked like a man with 100 things to say who didn't know where to begin. I waited. I had waited this long. A few more seconds wouldn't matter. "I owe you an apology," Daniel said finally. His voice was quiet, not the confident, room-filling voice from family dinners. Something smaller. Truer. I said things over the years that weren't fair. I made assumptions. I looked at him steadily. I had thought about this moment many times, how I would respond, what I would say. But standing there in the empty lobby of the building I had built, I found that most of what I'd stored up no longer needed saying. He already knew. He was standing inside the proof of everything he had underestimated. "I know," I said simply. He rubbed the back of his neck. "I didn't know what you were doing. You never told anyone." "That was my choice," I said quietly. He looked around the lobby slowly, the way someone looks at a place after learning it means something completely different than they assumed. "You built this," he said, more to himself than to me. It wasn't a question. "I built this," I confirmed. We stood in the kind of silence that doesn't need filling. Then I said, "You've been doing good work here, Daniel. That's the truth." He looked at me. Something in his face shifted. I didn't fire him. I didn't ask him to leave. I didn't bring up old arguments or ask for any kind of dramatic reckoning. That had never been the point. The point had always been the work itself. And now the work spoke clearly enough. Over the following weeks, things shifted in quiet ways. Daniel became even more focused in his role. Yolanda noticed it before I did. She mentioned that he had taken on additional responsibilities without being asked, and that he had started mentoring 2 of the newer junior staff on the operations team. I heard through Yolanda that he had also been quieter than usual in meetings, more thoughtful, less quick to dominate conversations. I recognized that change. It was the kind of adjustment that happened when someone's view of the world had been rearranged at its foundations. He wasn't shrinking. He was recalibrating, learning to listen in the way that I had always been forced to listen. I didn't know if it would last. People don't always hold on to their most important lessons. But I watched from a distance and hoped for him, the way I had always quietly hoped for him. Not out of weakness. Out of the simple fact that he was my brother, and that had never stopped being true. About 6 weeks after the ceremony, Mom called again. Her voice was lighter. She said Daniel had come to see her during the week, just the 2 of them, and had told her the full story. The building me, everything he hadn't known. Mom sat quietly while he talked, and when he finished, she shared something she had carried for a long time. that she had always seen something big in me, even when she couldn't name what shape it would one day take. I listened and felt something warm settle through my chest. She always knew, Daniel had apparently said. Why didn't she say anything? And Mom replied, because Maya doesn't need to say anything. She just does. When Mom told me that, I stepped away from my desk and faced the window. The city moved in every direction, everyone carrying their own quiet story. I thought about the 24-year-old who had stood in front of a crumbling old building with a notepad and a decision. I thought about every early morning since then, every late night, every moment I chose the work over the applause. And I thought, yes, this is exactly how it was supposed to go. The next family gathering was at Mom's house, the way it always was. The same pepper soup, the same round table, the same chairs that had been in that kitchen since I was a teenager. But something had shifted in the air between us. Daniel arrived before me, which was unusual. He was helping Mom in the kitchen when I walked in. He looked up and gave me a nod. Not the old look, not the one that slid past me toward something more interesting. A real, direct nod. Like one person acknowledging another as an equal. I nodded back. We didn't hug or make a big moment of it. It was quieter than that. More honest. At dinner, when our uncle made a light joke about me and my freelance life, Daniel was the one who spoke up. He said calmly and without any fuss, Maya runs a serious real estate development company. You should see what she's built. The table went quiet. Mom looked at her soup. I looked at my plate. I felt the warmth of it, not triumph, not vindication. Just the simple, settled feeling of being known. Of the truth finally taking up its rightful space in the room. I went back to the Halcyon building on a quiet Sunday morning, 2 months after the ceremony. The tenants were just beginning to arrive, unlocking their doors, setting up their spaces. I stood in the lobby and watched for a while. Then I took the elevator up to the rooftop one more time. The city spread out below me in every direction. I stood there quietly, not thinking about the next property or the next deal. Just standing in the thing I had made. There is a particular kind of satisfaction that comes not from being recognized, but from knowing, deep in your bones, that the work was real. That it existed. That no one could take the truth of it away from you. Daniel had finally seen it. The family had finally seen it. But the truth had existed long before any of them looked. That was the part one wanted to remember. The years of quiet effort before any stage or ribbon or ceremony. The part that no one watched. The part that built everything. I had always believed that honest work, done with patience, would eventually stand on its own. Standing on that rooftop, I knew I had been right. If this story reminded you that choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary, you're not alone. Maybe you've had to set boundaries with family. Maybe you've had to walk away from people who expected you to stay small. If that's your story too, the comments are yours. I read every single one. And if stories like this remind you of your own strength, subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories like this coming. I'll see you in the next one.